There was a town tucked away in the rolling hills of Vermont, cloaked in autumn mist and blanketed by fiery leaves. This town, Winthrop's Hollow, was so remote that it didn't even appear on most maps. Those who knew of it spoke in whispers, muttering about a darkness that clung to the town like a second skin. If you visited, locals would tell you of one night in particular, a Halloween night, years back, when something happened that forever changed the Hollow. They called it the Silent Harvest. A group of 4 college friends, Lena, Nate, Miles, and Cass, decided to spend their Halloween in Winthrop's Hollow, hoping to unravel the mystery that had been fueling urban legends for decades. They were true crime fanatics, always digging into unsolved cases and paranormal tales, and the Hollow was their holy grail of eerie destinations. They'd heard rumors of haunted woods, of children's laughter echoing where no children should be, and most notably of townsfolk who were never seen again after that fateful night. Lena's aunt, a resident of a neighboring town, told them they'd be fine as long as they stayed on the main road. "Don't go near the harvest grounds," she'd warned. "No one's allowed there anymore, not since the Hollow went dark." The harvest grounds were an abandoned apple orchard where people used to gather every October for cider, games, and a community harvest festival. But years ago, the orchard had been left to rot, the trees twisted and blackened as if from some terrible disease. The townsfolk said the trees had absorbed the fear and grief of that awful night, and now no one dared set foot there. Ignoring all advice, the friends went straight to the harvest grounds. They'd arrived early in the day, joking and laughing, but as soon as they stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the orchard, a strange chill settled over them, cutting through their sweaters. The place felt wrong, silent in a way that was both unnatural and oppressive. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves, though there was no wind. "Is it just me, or is it getting colder?" Cass asked, rubbing her arms as she glanced back towards the road, which had all but disappeared in the encroaching fog. They pressed on, laughing off the nerves that danced in their stomachs. The air grew thicker as they neared the center of the orchard, the trees leaning in as if watching. Just as they reached an open clearing, they noticed something strange. Rows upon rows of old-fashioned scarecrows, lined up and staring towards them. These weren't ordinary scarecrows. Each wore ragged clothing from a different era, and each had a burlap sack for a face, stitched with expressions that seemed frozen in terror, confusion, and sorrow. "Who would go to the trouble of making all these?" Nate muttered, glancing at the eerie figures. As they stepped deeper into the clearing, a shiver passed through them all. They suddenly felt as though they were intruding, as if 100 invisible eyes were watching from behind the trees. Lena pointed to one scarecrow standing apart from the others, wearing a faded red scarf. "Look at that one. It almost looks like, I don't know, like it's watching us." Miles laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Guys, I think we're letting the stories get to us." But even as he spoke, they all noticed something odd. The fog seemed to thicken around the scarecrows, each one dimly outlined as if caught in a trick of the light. Cass, feeling braver than the others, walked up to the one with the red scarf and reached out to touch it. As her fingers brushed the fabric, she felt something soft, too soft for straw. She jerked her hand back, a sick realization dawning on her. These aren't just scarecrows," she stammered. "This one, I felt something, like skin." A sudden, soft crunch sounded behind them. They turned to see another scarecrow, one that hadn't been there before, standing a few feet closer, staring with hollow, stitched eyes. Its face seemed familiar, and dread pooled in their stomachs as they realized it was wearing clothing eerily similar to what Miles had worn just a few days ago. "What the hell?" Miles whispered, stepping back. And then, one by one, the other scarecrows began to shift, inching toward them, their heads tilted in uncanny angles, the stitched faces somehow more expressive, as though they were watching, judging, waiting. "Run!" Lena shouted. They stumbled through the fog, the path twisting and bending in ways it hadn't on their way in, as if the orchard itself was shifting to trap them. They heard footsteps behind them, faint, soft shuffling sounds like old clothes dragging through leaves. No matter how fast they ran, the scarecrows were right behind them. Nate tripped and fell. When he looked up, a scarecrow loomed over him, its burlap face stitched into a wide grin that stretched ear to ear, the eyes now glistening with a dull, hungry gleam. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the mist. The remaining three tore through the path, lungs burning, but they could feel it, the cold, spectral presence of something drawing closer. And then they saw it. A faint light ahead, the exit to the orchard. They pushed forward, stumbling onto the main road, just as the first stars began to appear in the sky. They didn't stop running until they reached the car, slamming the doors shut, hearts pounding as they glanced back toward the orchard. The fog had thickened, swallowing the path entirely. There was no sign of Nate. They drove all the way back to town, wild-eyed and panicked, but when they arrived at the sheriff's office to report what had happened, they were met with blank stares. "We haven't had any new residents in Winthrop's Hollow in decades," the sheriff said, frowning as he looked over their story. He pointed to a photo on the wall, yellowed and fading. It showed a group of young people gathered around the orchard's entrance, dressed in 90s clothing, laughing, carefree. "That was the last group to disappear in the Hollow," the sheriff said. "They were reported missing on Halloween night 30 years ago. There was a boy named Nate with them too, but since then no one's been allowed near that orchard." Lena, Cass, and Miles felt a sickening chill as they looked at the photo again. The faces were too familiar. They could see themselves in the image, captured in black and white, their own expressions frozen in terror as they faced the orchard. The sheriff's voice echoed in their minds as he left them alone in the room. "The Hollow keeps what it wants," he'd whispered, "and it never lets go." In the dense, silent woods of southern Appalachia, there is an old trail that locals refuse to take after dark. The path is called Moon's End, though no one remembers why. Some say it got its name because even in the brightest full moon, once you're on that trail, the light fades. But the people who know the true story avoid the trail altogether, especially in late autumn when the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. One cold October evening, Emma and her boyfriend Josh decided to explore Moon's End. They were skeptical of local legends and excited to find something to scare themselves with, something they could laugh about later. Armed with flashlights and bundled in warm jackets, they made their way up the trail just as the last rays of sun vanished behind the mountains. The forest around them grew dark and deathly quiet, the only sounds their own footsteps crunching on dried leaves. About a mile in, the silence became oppressive, and both of them felt the eerie sensation of being watched. Josh, trying to lighten the mood, cracked jokes, but Emma's laugh sounded forced. The air felt heavy, and a smell began to waft toward them. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It was the smell of decay, of something rotten. "Maybe it's a dead animal," Josh suggested, though his voice wavered. They pressed on, hoping to shake the feeling, but the deeper they went, the darker it got. Soon, their flashlights barely seemed to penetrate the gloom, and a cold, unnatural mist drifted along the ground, snaking between the trees. They kept walking, but it felt as though they were being drawn deeper into the woods, as though the trail was winding and changing beneath their feet. Suddenly, they saw a flickering light ahead, like a lantern swaying gently in the darkness. Thinking they might have stumbled upon a house or a campsite, they hurried forward, calling out, but when they reached the source of the light, they froze. The lantern hung from an old, gnarled tree, illuminating a strange sight. A pile of stones, carefully arranged in a circle, with a decaying doll propped in the center. The doll was old-fashioned, with a porcelain face cracked and smeared, its faded eyes staring straight at them. Its dress was tattered, and there were dark stains on the cloth. Emma shivered. "Who would leave this out here?" she whispered, clutching Josh's arm. As they backed away, they heard a voice, a faint whisper, high and cold, echoing from the shadows beyond the circle of stones. They couldn't make out the words, but the voice was distinctly that of a child. "No way," Josh muttered, grabbing Emma's hand. "Let's get out of here." But as they turned back, the trail they'd come from had vanished, swallowed by mist and shadow. Their hearts pounded as they shone their flashlights around, looking for any sign of the path. Then in the darkness, they heard the sound of something soft and light brushing against the leaves, moving in their direction. It was the sound of small footsteps. Emma held her breath as she saw a figure emerge from the mist, a little girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face hidden by the shadows. She moved toward them slowly, her bare feet making almost no sound as she approached the lantern. The child lifted her face, and Emma let out a strangled gasp. The girl's eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to absorb all the light around her. Her mouth twisted into a strange, crooked smile, too wide as if the skin at the corners of her lips had been stretched. The girl reached out a hand, her small, skeletal fingers curling towards Emma. In a voice that sounded like it was being dragged through water, the girl whispered, "Come play with me." Frozen in terror, Emma felt herself being pulled toward the girl, her feet sliding forward on the damp leaves. Josh grabbed her, breaking her trance, and together they stumbled back, tripping over roots and branches, trying desperately to escape. But every direction they turned, the little girl was there watching them, her black eyes glistening in the lantern's eerie glow. At last, they found the remnants of the trail and bolted, pushing themselves through the darkness, ignoring the low branches that scratched their faces. The child's laughter echoed around them, blending with the rustling leaves, a soft, sickening sound that seemed to come from all directions. When they finally burst out of the woods, gasping for air, the night was still and silent again. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, not daring to look back. But as Emma yanked open the door, she saw something on the back seat, something that hadn't been there before. It was the doll from the Circle of Stones, its cracked porcelain face and lifeless eyes fixed on her. In its hand, a scrap of her own scarf stained with something dark. Her hands trembled as she stared, unable to look away. Then in the silence she heard it, a faint, childlike whisper from the darkness just beyond the car. "I'll find you again, next autumn." In the heart of rural Maine, there was a desolate stretch of land known only as Deadman's Field. No one was quite sure why it got its name, but the locals whispered that the land was cursed. Few dared to even drive by it, especially in late October, when the leaves fell like blood-red rain and the days grew dark and cold. Generations of townsfolk had shared stories of the field and warned that strange things happened to anyone foolish enough to spend time there alone. One autumn night, a young woman named Marcy drove along the back roads toward her grandmother's house. She'd taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way and found herself driving past Deadman's Field. Her car sputtered, and with a sinking feeling, she realized it was running out of gas. Cursing her luck, she pulled to the side of the road, right by the field's edge, with no cell signal and no one in sight. Marcy sighed, wrapping her jacket around herself as she got out of the car. The wind had a bite to it, whispering through the trees, making her feel uneasy. The only way back to town was a narrow path that led through Deadman's Field. She weighed her options, then decided to take the shortcut. With each step, her boots crunched over brittle leaves, and she felt as if 1,000 eyes were watching her. As she walked deeper into the field, she noticed something strange. There were scarecrows scattered throughout, standing in a row along the path, their ragged clothes flapping in the wind. But these weren't typical scarecrows. They were tall, nearly as tall as her, with heads fashioned from old burlap sacks. The faces were crudely drawn, with wide, painted eyes and mouths twisted into grins that were too wide, too unnatural. Trying to ignore them, Marcy quickened her pace. But as she passed each scarecrow, she could swear she heard the soft sound of cloth moving. Once she glanced back, convinced she'd seen one turn its head. But when she looked, it stood motionless, its empty eyes fixed straight ahead. Her heart pounded, her breath quickening as she realized she was halfway through the field. But something caught her eye, a faint flicker of light up ahead. Relieved, she moved toward it, thinking it might be a house or a campfire. But as she drew closer, her heart sank. The light wasn't from a house. It was a small, old-fashioned lantern hanging from a tree, casting a dim, orange glow over a crudely marked grave. The grave looked freshly dug, the earth still loose. At the head of it was a small, weathered headstone, so old that the name had nearly eroded away. She shivered, wondering who would leave a lantern burning by an empty grave in the middle of the field. Marcy turned to leave, but her foot caught on something in the dirt. She stumbled, looking down to see the edge of a cloth sticking out from the soil. The fabric was thick and worn, and as she knelt to pull it free, she realized with horror that it was a sleeve attached to a buried arm. Her scream caught in her throat as she pulled back. But as she stumbled, she heard a sound, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Help me!" The voice was barely audible, but it was unmistakably human. Marcy's breath hitched as she looked down at the arm, her mind racing. She backed away slowly, fighting the urge to run, but as she turned, she froze. The scarecrows had shifted. They were now facing her, each with its wide, painted grin, the twisted mouths stretching wider than she'd remembered. The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Help, please." Marcy's heart raced, but she was paralyzed by fear. The wind howled and the lantern's light flickered. She tried to scream, to call for help, but her voice wouldn't come. One by one, the scarecrows began to shudder, moving as if waking from a long slumber. Their heads tilted, the burlap faces contorting, the painted eyes seeming to come alive, following her every move. Panicked, Marcy broke into a run, pushing through the field, but with every step she felt something cold on her neck, as if unseen hands were reaching out to grab her. She didn't dare look back. The whispering followed her, growing louder and louder, blending into what sounded like a chorus of voices, each one pleading for her to come back, to dig them up, to free them from their graves. The scarecrows seemed to close in around her, forming a ring along the path, their painted faces turning to follow her, their mouths stretching wider and wider. And as she reached the edge of the field, she tripped and fell, the dirt on her hands cold and damp. With trembling hands, she crawled to her feet and scrambled back to her car, throwing herself into the driver's seat. She twisted the key in the ignition, and miraculously, the engine roared to life. As she sped away, she dared one last look in her rearview mirror. The scarecrows were lined up along the edge of Deadman's Field, their painted eyes glistening in the moonlight, mouths twisted into grins that seemed to taunt her. And standing just beyond them, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure in tattered clothing, half buried, reaching one skeletal hand toward the road. Marcy didn't stop driving until she was miles away, her heart racing, hands shaking on the wheel. She told herself it wasn't real, that it was just her imagination. But that night, as she lay in bed, she heard the soft sound of cloth brushing against the floor. And somewhere in the darkness, a faint whisper called out to her, "Help!" In a small, forgotten town in Pennsylvania, there was a house known to everyone simply as the Never-Ending House. The locals claimed it was cursed, that anyone who entered would never truly leave. No one knew who had built it, and most townsfolk avoided the crumbling old mansion, tucked far back in the woods, hidden behind gnarled trees that twisted and arched as if protecting it from prying eyes. The house seemed to breathe with its own life, creaking and groaning even when no wind stirred. For years, kids dared each other to step inside, to explore the endless maze of rooms and hallways, but few ever stayed long. The lucky ones made it out with only vague memories of shadowy figures or whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Others never spoke of what they saw, their silence a kind of quiet horror that clung to them long after they'd left. But one Halloween, a group of 3 friends, Evan, Liv, and Marcus, decided to spend the night there, determined to prove that the stories were just that, stories. They arrived just as the sun was setting, its last rays casting an eerie glow on the cracked windows and peeling paint. As they pushed open the front door, the stale, musty air seemed to wrap around them, thick and suffocating. The door creaked and slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the empty house like a warning. "Guess there's no turning back," Liv joked, though her voice trembled. The main hallway stretched on farther than it should have, with walls that seemed to ripple in the dim light. They tried to turn on their flashlights, but the beams were weak, barely penetrating the dark. Each room they passed was empty, but they were filled with strange, twisted shadows that moved as if alive. After an hour of wandering, they started to feel strange, as if the house were subtly shifting around them. They found themselves passing the same hallway over and over, its wallpaper peeling in familiar patterns, its light fixtures swaying as though disturbed by a passing breeze. But no windows led outside and no door opened to the world beyond. "Okay, this is weird," Evan said, his voice barely a whisper. "We've been here before, right?" They all nodded, unease settling in. Liv laughed nervously. "I think we're just spooking ourselves. It's just an old house, right?" But as they ventured deeper, each step felt heavier, each turn more disorienting. It was Marcus who noticed first. The wallpaper was starting to change. At first, it was subtle. Faint lines appeared along the walls, like cracks spidering out. But when they took a closer look, they realized the cracks were forming shapes, faces, eyes, noses, mouths frozen in expressions of horror, as if the house itself had absorbed the terror of those who'd been trapped inside before. "Let's get out of here," Marcus muttered, his voice barely concealing his fear. They retraced their steps, but no matter which way they went, they always ended up back in the same long hallway with the faces on the wall. Liv, feeling the walls closing in around her, spotted a staircase that hadn't been there before. Without thinking, she started up, Evan and Marcus following close behind. The stairs seemed to go on forever, spiraling up into darkness, each step groaning under their weight. But as they climbed, the stairs began to change too, warping, growing colder, until they felt like stone beneath their feet. When they finally reached the top, they found themselves in a narrow hallway lined with doors, each identical, stretching on as far as they could see. Each door was marked with a number, and they all realized with a chill that they each corresponded to different years. 1876, 1912, 1945, 1967, some years recent, some nearly lost to time. Evan tried to open the nearest door, but it wouldn't budge. He tried the next, but it too was locked tight. Desperate, they went from door to door, banging, rattling the handles, calling out in growing terror. But there was no answer. The silence pressed down on them, thick and ominous. Just when they were about to give up, one door creaked open, a door marked 2023. With no other choice, they stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb that swung from the ceiling. The walls were covered in old photographs, all black and white, their subjects blurred and distorted. Liv reached out to touch one, squinting to make out the faces, but then froze. The people in the photographs looked just like them. Their own faces stared back at them, expressions frozen in terror, their hands outstretched as if reaching for help. "What? How?" Marcus stammered, stepping back, his face pale. But as they tried to leave, they realized the door had closed behind them. Frantically, they pounded on it, screaming, but their voices seemed to vanish, absorbed into the thick silence. The room began to shift, walls closing in as if shrinking. The light flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. They could feel it, the presence of something else, watching them, moving in the shadows. The whispers started then, faint at first but growing louder, surrounding them, voices overlapping, pleading, crying out in terror. "Don't leave us. Help us. We're still here." In the suffocating dark, Liv's flashlight flickered back on, casting a weak beam over the far wall. There, scratched into the paint, were hundreds of names, names of those who had entered the never-ending house and never left. At the very bottom, 3 fresh names had appeared: Evan, Liv, and Marcus. As they stared in horror, they felt it. The walls pressing closer, an unbearable weight pressing down on them, pulling them into the very bones of the house. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, each more desperate than the last, and they realized, with growing dread, that they were now part of the house, trapped with the others. Days later, a group of teenagers, curious and reckless, decided to venture into the old mansion for Halloween. They pushed open the door, laughing as they stepped inside. And as they walked down the main hallway, they didn't notice that 3 new faces had joined the wallpaper, their eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams, forever part of the cursed walls of the never-ending house. In a small, tightly knit town, there was an old library hidden in the depths of the woods. Most locals had forgotten it existed, or perhaps they'd chosen to forget. The building was a relic from another era, its stone walls overtaken by ivy, its windows dark and empty. Everyone who grew up there knew the story. The library had been closed since the 1930s, when a young woman named Clara, the head librarian, vanished without a trace. But on Halloween night, the rumor went, the library's lights would flicker to life, and the spirit of Clara would beckon visitors inside. A pair of teens, Mark and Sarah, always dismissed the tale as an urban legend. They were amateur ghost hunters, and they thought the library would make for the perfect Halloween adventure. That night, armed with flashlights and a camera, they set out toward the library, ignoring the cold mist that seemed to wrap around them like bony fingers as they approached. As they arrived, they saw something strange. A soft, warm light glowed from the windows, casting an orange hue that flickered like candlelight. "Guess the old place still has power?" Sarah joked nervously, but Mark's smile was forced as he pushed open the heavy doors. Inside, the library was silent. Rows upon rows of ancient bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty books whose titles were barely readable. But the place didn't smell of mold or rot like they'd expected. Instead, a faint, sweet scent hung in the air, like old roses, mixed with something metallic, like rust. Their flashlights seemed to dim, casting only the faintest glow in the dark. They wandered deeper into the library, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Despite the apparent emptiness, they both felt like they were being watched. Shadows seemed to dance in the corners of the room, shifting and swirling as though alive. Mark took out his camera, snapping pictures, but the screen only showed darkness. It was as if the light from their flashlights couldn't capture what was really there. Then they heard it, a faint shuffling, like footsteps in the distance. They froze, looking at each other. "It's probably just a raccoon or something," Mark whispered, trying to sound calm, though his voice quivered. They followed the sound, which led them to the basement door, slightly ajar. Cold air seeped from the gap, carrying that same metallic smell, only stronger now, more pungent. Sarah hesitated, but Mark pushed the door open, and they descended into the darkness below. The basement was lined with stone walls, the ceiling low and oppressive. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. Their flashlights barely penetrated the gloom. But then, as they reached the bottom step, they saw it. A desk in the center of the room, lit by an old oil lamp that flickered on its own. Behind the desk was a figure, its back turned to them, hunched over as if reading a book. "Clara?" Sarah whispered before she could stop herself. The figure froze, and then, slowly, it turned to face them. What they saw made their blood run cold. The woman's face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide and sunken, filled with a mixture of sorrow and fury. Her skin had the color and texture of paper, almost translucent, and dark, hollow rings surrounded her eyes. She wore an old-fashioned librarian's dress, stained and frayed. The smell of roses intensified, but now there was no mistaking the underlying stench of decay. The ghostly woman raised a finger to her lips, her voice soft but cold. "Shh! You're disturbing the readers." They took a step back, but behind them the shadows began to move, swirling and solidifying. Out of the darkness, other figures began to emerge, dozens of them, their faces blank, their bodies cloaked in shadow. They seemed to be a part of the darkness itself, and each holding a book that they clutched tightly to their chests, their hollow eyes fixed on Mark and Sarah. One of the figures shuffled closer, and Mark saw its face. A young boy, his expression locked in a permanent look of horror, as though he'd seen something that had driven him mad. The boy opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a dry, crackling sound filled the air, like the pages of an old book turning. We need to go," Sarah stammered, tugging at Mark's arm. But as they turned to flee, the basement door slammed shut, and the oil lamp went out, plunging them into darkness. The shadows closed in, the faint rustling of pages growing louder and louder, filling their ears like a sinister chant. In the pitch-black room, they could feel the cold, bony hands reaching out, pulling them down, down into the endless dark. Mark and Sarah tried to scream, but the shadows muffled their voices, and as they struggled, they felt the weight of the books being pressed into their hands. They could barely make out the titles: Lost, Vanished, Forever Forgotten. Each book was inscribed with a single name on the spine. The last name they saw, before the shadows claimed them completely, was Mark's own. The next morning, their families searched for them, but Mark and Sarah were never seen again. The townsfolk whispered that the library had claimed 2 more souls that night, adding them to its collection. And every Halloween, when the library lights flickered to life, those brave enough to venture near swore they could hear faint whispers and the turning of pages, as if the restless souls trapped inside were still reading, forever bound to the library's dark, endless shelves. It was a tradition in a sleepy little town for families to visit the autumn harvest corn maze on Halloween night. Kids dressed in costumes would wind their way through the maze, laughing and shouting as they scrambled through the tall, dry stalks of corn. But everyone knew there was a rule: never go in after midnight. By then, the maze was supposed to change, though no one knew exactly what that meant. There were whispers of people who had stayed too late and never returned, but these were dismissed as legends meant to scare kids. This year, a group of teenagers decided to test the legend. Lily, Alex, and Sam waited until the crowd had dwindled, hiding behind some hay bales until the lights went out and the workers left. At the stroke of midnight, they entered the maze with flashlights in hand, giggling nervously, but trying to act brave. The only sounds were the rustling of corn stalks in the gentle wind and the occasional hoot of an owl. At first, they followed the familiar path, turning left and right, feeling the thrill of the empty, dark maze. But after about 10 minutes, they started to feel uneasy. Each turn led to another twist, each pathway seemingly identical. Lily noticed the tall corn stalks seemed thicker, almost like they were closing in, towering over them in the dark. "Does it feel like we're going in circles?" Sam muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's just scarier at night," Alex said, laughing it off, but his voice was strained. They kept walking, but no matter which path they chose, they couldn't seem to find a way out. As their flashlights darted over the corn, they noticed strange shapes carved into the husks, symbols that looked ancient, like something out of a dark folk tale. One symbol looked like an eye, and another like a twisted hand. "Is this part of the maze?" Lily asked, her voice tight with worry. Just then, they heard the faint sound of footsteps behind them. They spun around, shining their flashlights into the rows, but there was nothing there. "Probably some animal," Sam muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. They pressed on, their nerves fraying as the darkness grew thicker and the maze more twisted. Suddenly, Alex saw something glinting in the dirt. He knelt down and picked up a necklace, a simple pendant with a small silver locket. He recognized it immediately. "This is Katie's," he whispered, his voice hollow. Katie was a girl from their high school who had vanished a few years back. She had been last seen at the corn maze, but no one had ever found a trace of her. The townsfolk had assumed she'd run away. But here was her locket, buried in the dirt as if it had been waiting for them. "Let's get out of here," Lily said, her voice quivering. They turned to retrace their steps, but every path seemed to lead them deeper, further away from the exit. Their flashlights began to flicker, the batteries fading faster than they should. Panic began to set in. They tried to run, but the maze felt endless, the paths looping back on themselves. Then the rustling of footsteps came again, louder this time, as if something were following them, keeping pace just out of sight. Alex's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into near darkness. Sam and Lily's lights dimmed but held, casting a faint glow over the path. They moved faster, their breaths coming quick and shallow. The symbols on the corn began to glow faintly in the dark, pulsing with a strange, sickly light. Shadows flitted between the rows, darting out of sight just as they turned their heads. They came to a split in the path, and without thinking, they each took a different turn. "Wait!" Lily cried, but it was too late. She heard Sam's footsteps receding down one path and Alex's fading down another, leaving her alone. Heart pounding, Lily turned back, shouting their names, but there was no response. The rustling of the corn grew louder, surrounding her. She took a few steps forward, and that's when she saw him, a figure standing still in the shadows. "Sam?" she called, voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. It was tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the dark, watching her. Its mouth was stretched into an unnatural smile, too wide, its teeth sharp and jagged. She staggered back, tripping over a root, her flashlight clattering to the ground. When she looked up again, the figure was gone. Lily scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She bolted down the path, hoping to find Sam and Alex. But the maze had changed. The paths were different. The symbols on the corn now glowing brighter, illuminating more figures. People frozen in the stalks, their faces twisted in expressions of terror, mouths open in silent screams. One of them looked like Katie. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide and vacant, her body almost blending with the corn itself, as if she had become part of the maze. Lily screamed, turning to run, but no matter which way she went, she couldn't escape the maze. She saw Sam's flashlight abandoned on the ground, and a little farther on, Alex's watch, its face cracked and frozen. The sounds of laughter and voices drifted through the corn, familiar yet distant, as if coming from another time, another world. Finally, Lily found herself back at the beginning of the maze, or what she thought was the beginning. But something was different. The scarecrow that had stood there earlier was gone. In its place was a new figure, a girl with hollow eyes and a terrified expression, her hands outstretched, frozen in place. The figure wore Lily's necklace, The next morning, the workers arrived to open the maze, but there was no sign of the three friends. Only a few trampled corn stalks and scattered belongings marked where they'd been. The maze was quiet, as it always was, but the townsfolk knew. Some of them whispered that if you went into the maze late at night, you could hear their voices, faint and desperate, calling for help. But few dared to test the legend. There's a remote stretch of forest near a small mountain town in Vermont, known locally as the Silent Pines. The townsfolk would tell you it's not a place for wandering, especially after dark. They say the trees in the Silent Pines swallow sound, that no birds sing, no animals stir, and that even footsteps become muffled in the heavy, almost oppressive silence. But every few years, someone curious or reckless enters the woods, never to be seen again. One autumn evening, a group of 4 college friends, Emma, Leo, Jack, and Sophie, decided to hike into the Silent Pines. They'd heard the stories growing up and wanted to prove the old legends wrong. They set off late in the afternoon, hoping to be back by nightfall, laughing and joking as the orange and gold leaves crunched underfoot. But as they moved deeper into the forest, the laughter faded. It was almost as if the silence crept up on them, wrapping itself around their voices, muting everything. The air grew colder, sharper, and even their footsteps grew faint. No one could hear the crunch of the leaves anymore, though they were sure they were still stepping on them. The silence pressed down, heavy and unnatural, as if the trees were listening. "Feels like the world's holding its breath," Jack muttered, glancing around. "Maybe it's just in our heads," Leo replied, trying to laugh, but his voice sounded thin and distant. They pressed on, but each step grew more difficult, as if the air itself were thickening. The trees seemed to crowd closer, their tall, dark trunks twisting slightly, creating narrow, maze-like paths that seemed to shift when they weren't looking. When Sophie glanced behind them, the path back had disappeared, the trees forming an unbroken line as if they'd never entered at all. "Let's turn around," she suggested, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her friends nodded, unease settling like a weight in their chests. They tried to retrace their steps, but the path had changed. Every direction they turned led deeper into the woods, and with each passing moment the silence grew heavier. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the forest floor, shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways, reaching out like fingers toward them. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin nestled in a small clearing. Its windows were broken, its roof sagging, and ivy crawled up its walls like veins. But the strangest part was the smell, a faint, sickly sweet scent like rotting flowers mixed with something earthy, something decayed. Desperate and tired, they decided to go inside, hoping to rest and figure out what to do. The air inside the cabin was stale and cold, the walls lined with strange markings scratched into the wood, spirals and twisted shapes that seemed to pulse in the dim light. Emma's flashlight cast a weak beam across the room, illuminating what looked like old photographs pinned to the walls. She squinted, moving closer, her heart pounding as she realized the photos were of people standing at the edge of the very same forest. Each face was frozen in terror, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with horror. This isn't right," she whispered, stepping back. Leo touched one of the photos and it felt strangely warm, like it was still alive. Then he noticed something else. Each photo had a name scrawled below it. As they scanned the names, Jack froze, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Guys, look." At the very end of the row, they saw 4 new photos. Their own faces stared back at them, their eyes filled with the same horror, as if the photos had been taken just moments before. Below each photo was a name: Emma, Leo, Jack, and Sophie. How? Sophie stammered, stepping back, her heart racing. Just then, the door of the cabin slammed shut behind them, the lock clicking into place on its own. The cabin's stale air turned cold, a chill settling over them as the shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and writhing as if they were alive. The faint smell of rot grew stronger, filling their noses and making their eyes water. The shadows coalesced into figures, tall and dark, with hollow eyes and twisted limbs, their mouths stretching into wide, unnatural grins. The silence pressed in so thick it felt like it was crushing them, muting their screams as the figures moved closer. Desperate, Jack tried the door, banging on it, but it wouldn't budge. Emma's flashlight flickered and went out, leaving them in near total darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the twisted symbols on the walls. The figures grew clearer in the dim light, their eyes fixed on the friends, their faces contorted with expressions of longing and despair. Then, from deep in the shadows, a voice whispered, soft and hollow, as if it came from the very walls themselves. "You are part of the forest now." One by one, the friends felt a strange sensation, like their bodies were growing heavier, rooted to the spot. Their feet seemed to sink into the wooden floor, the wood wrapping around them like vines. Their skin felt cold and stiff, their fingers growing numb as the silence wrapped around them like a shroud, muffling their cries. In the suffocating darkness, they became part of the cabin, their faces etched into the walls, their terror frozen for eternity. Outside, the silent pines stood still, unchanging, waiting for the next visitors who might dare to enter after dark. The next morning, hikers found the cabin, though it looked different from the descriptions they'd heard. They noticed strange carvings on the walls, faces of people they couldn't recognize, but one face seemed fresh, as if it had just been added. The face of a girl with wide, terrified eyes. The hikers shuddered and left, never noticing the faint, almost inaudible whispers from the walls, calling out, begging to be freed. But as they left the forest, the sound vanished, swallowed once more by the silence of the silent pines. The story of Caldwell Creek Bridge was well known in the small town nestled between mountains and forests. The bridge was an old rickety structure that stretched over a narrow but deep creek. It had been abandoned for decades, closed off to cars and foot traffic alike, and was overgrown with vines and moss. The townsfolk claimed that on some autumn nights, particularly around Halloween, you could see figures standing in the middle of the bridge, staring down into the water below. The story went that in the late 1940s, a school bus full of children had lost control and veered off the bridge, plunging into the icy creek below. No one survived, and since then there had been sightings of small handprints in the fog that gathered on the bridge's railings. Rumor had it that if you walked onto the bridge alone at night, you'd feel cold, ghostly fingers brush against your hand, trying to pull you into the water. One chilly October night, 3 friends, Ella, Max, and Tom, decided to check it out. They didn't believe the legends, but were excited by the thrill of the unknown. Armed with flashlights, they set off down the old trail toward Caldwell Creek Bridge, laughing and joking to mask the nervousness that gnawed at them. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant hoot of an owl. When they reached the bridge, the atmosphere shifted. The cold was sharper here, the air thick with a strange metallic scent like rusted metal and damp earth. The wind picked up, making the trees whisper, and the fog drifted in, settling over the bridge like a ghostly blanket. "All right, I guess we'll just walk across and see if we meet any ghosts," Max joked, trying to sound braver than he felt. They took a few cautious steps onto the bridge, their flashlights casting long shadows against the wooden planks. The boards creaked beneath them, and for a moment Ella swore she felt something small and cold brush against her ankle. She shivered, brushing it off as the wind. But the farther they walked, the colder it became, their breath forming faint clouds in the frigid air. When they reached the middle of the bridge, they stopped, looking down at the creek below. The water was black, rippling softly, as if something were moving just beneath the surface. The silence was so thick it felt oppressive, pressing against their ears. And then they noticed the handprints. Small, faint, child-sized prints were scattered along the bridge's rusty railings, some even overlapping, as if a group of children had pressed their hands there just moments before. But what made their blood run cold was that the handprints seemed to be shifting, slowly moving, as if they were being pressed from the other side. Tom nervously reached out to touch one of the prints, but before his hand could make contact, a cold, clammy sensation wrapped around his wrist. He recoiled, yanking his hand back, but the feeling lingered, like a small hand had gripped him. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, his voice shaking. They turned to leave, but the fog had thickened, enveloping the bridge and hiding the way back. The air was so dense it was like breathing underwater, and their flashlights only penetrated a few feet ahead. Suddenly, a faint, distant sound broke the silence, a soft, childlike giggle echoing through the mist. Ella's heart pounded as she scanned the fog. Her flashlight caught a flicker of movement, a shadow standing at the far end of the bridge. It looked like a child, head tilted to the side, staring at them with wide, hollow eyes. She blinked and the figure vanished, only to reappear closer, standing directly in their path. What is that?" Max stammered, clutching his flashlight like a lifeline. The giggling grew louder and the shadowy figure stepped closer, joined by others, small, translucent figures with pale faces and vacant eyes, all staring at the three friends. Their mouths opened in silent, eerie grins, their hands reaching out as if begging to be held. Panicking, they backed up, only to find their way blocked by more shadowy figures. The bridge was filled with them now. Children from another time, their eyes filled with sorrow and an unnatural hunger. And then, in unison, the children spoke, their voices soft and hollow, like leaves rustling in the wind. "Come play with us." The friends turned, scrambling toward the edge of the bridge. But the boards seemed to grow soft underfoot, like sinking into mud, trapping their feet. The small, cold hands were everywhere now, brushing against their arms, their legs, tugging at them with quiet, rough, unyielding strength. Ella lost her footing and fell to her knees, feeling the icy grip tighten around her ankles, pulling her toward the edge. She clutched at the railing, but it, too, was covered in faint, shifting handprints that seemed to reach for her, pressing against her hands, cold and relentless. "Help!" she screamed, but her voice sounded muted, as though the fog itself was swallowing the sound. Max and Tom tried to pull her up, but they felt the same cold, clammy hands gripping them, dragging them down. The figures pressed in closer, their empty eyes unblinking, their mouths stretching into impossible, unnatural smiles. One of them reached out, brushing a cold finger against Ella's cheek, and she felt a strange, numbing sensation, like ice spreading under her skin. In a final, desperate effort, Max managed to pull Ella to her feet, and they broke into a sprint, pushing through the fog, their legs numb and heavy. The laughter grew fainter, but the icy touch lingered, following them even as they reached the end of the bridge. They didn't stop running until they were back in town, collapsing on the sidewalk, gasping for air. When they looked back toward the forest, the bridge was shrouded in mist once more, silent and still. The figures were gone, but the memory of their pale, hollow faces lingered, etched into their minds. The next day, Ella noticed a faint, bruise-like mark on her wrist, shaped like a small handprint. No matter how much she tried to rub it away, it stayed, a constant reminder of the ghostly children on Caldwell Creek Bridge. And sometimes late at night, she could still hear the soft, childlike giggles echoing in her mind, as though they were waiting for her to return. There was an old farmhouse just outside of town that had been abandoned for decades. Locals called it the Red House because, as the legend went, the walls had once been painted a deep crimson that faded to a haunting, dull red. People claimed it was haunted by the spirits of its last owners, a family of 5 who had died under mysterious circumstances in the early 1900s. Rumor had it that the family simply disappeared one night, leaving everything as it was, and when they were found, their faces were twisted in terror, hands clawing at the walls as if trying to escape something unspeakable. And one night, a group of friends, Sarah, Danny, and Will, decided to check it out. They were always fascinated by haunted places, and the Red House was the ultimate local legend. They waited until midnight, armed with flashlights and their phones, and made their way down the narrow, overgrown path leading to the farmhouse. The trees seemed to close in around them as they approached, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out to block their way. As they reached the house, they paused, feeling a chill settle over them. The Red House was larger than they'd imagined, looming against the night sky with shattered windows that seemed to stare back like hollow eyes. The paint was indeed a faded, eerie red, with streaks running down the walls as if the house itself had been bleeding. They exchanged nervous glances but pushed forward, the front door creaking as they entered. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying a metallic scent like old, rusted iron. Dust hung heavy in the air, and their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the house were amplifying each sound. "Do you feel that?" Sarah whispered, looking around. It was as if the house were watching them. They moved from room to room, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The furniture was still in place, covered in dust, but everything looked untouched, as though the family might return at any moment. Plates were set on the dining table, a cup of tea sat on a side table, and even an old photograph was hanging crookedly on the wall, a sepia-toned image of the family that had lived there, a mother, father, and 3 children, all staring back with vacant, blank expressions. Creepy, Will muttered, stepping closer to the photo. But then he froze, noticing something strange. The eyes in the photo seemed wrong, almost hollow, and he could have sworn they were watching him. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it, but a strange sense of dread clawed at him. They moved to the staircase, which creaked with each step. As they reached the second floor, a faint noise caught their attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against a wall. They followed the sound down the hallway, stopping in front of a closed door. "Should we go in?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. The door opened to reveal what must have once been a child's bedroom. Toys were scattered across the floor, a small bed with faded sheets in the corner, but what drew their attention immediately was a strange set of handprints smeared on the wall. They were small, as if left by a child, but they were deep red, the color of dried blood. "Is that paint?" Sarah asked, but she didn't sound convinced. The air grew colder, and the tapping resumed, louder this time, coming from the closet. Sarah, feeling a mixture of fear and curiosity, approached and opened the door. Inside, it was empty, except for an old, dusty teddy bear lying on the floor. But as she reached down to pick it up, she froze. A faint whisper, so soft it was barely audible, echoed in her ear. "Help me." Sarah stumbled back, dropping the bear. The whisper grew louder, joined by more voices, all overlapping, all pleading and desperate. It sounded like the voices were coming from within the walls themselves, like the house was filled with trapped souls, clawing and scratching to get out. "Let's go." "Now," Danny said, turning to leave. But as they stepped back into the hallway, they found that the staircase was gone. Where it should have been was now just a solid wall, as if the house had shifted, trapping them on the second floor. "What's happening?" Will shouted, panic rising in his voice. They tried other doors, but every room seemed to lead back to the same hallway, looping endlessly, trapping them in a nightmarish maze. The tapping grew louder, the whispers more insistent, begging and pleading, "Help us! Help us!" Then, one of the voices broke through, louder than the others, filled with anger and despair. "You're not supposed to be here." The lights on their flashlights began to flicker, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. The red handprints began to move, streaking down the walls as though fresh blood were running, pooling at their feet. They could feel something watching them, something malevolent, lurking just beyond the edges of their vision. Suddenly, they heard footsteps echoing down the hall, slow and deliberate. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway, a shadowy, indistinct form that seemed to pulse with darkness, its hollow eyes fixed on them. The figure reached out a hand and the whispers turned to screams, filling the house with a deafening cacophony of terror. "Run!" Sarah screamed, though there was nowhere to go. They stumbled through the hallway, pushing through door after door, but every room was the same, looping back into that cursed hallway, no escape in sight. Finally, in a desperate attempt, Danny grabbed a chair and smashed it against one of the walls, creating a small opening. Beyond the wall, they could see the outside, the night sky, the trees. They scrambled through the hole one by one, squeezing into the open air, their hearts racing as they hit the ground and ran without looking back. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, they turned to see the house in the distance. But it looked different. It was old, yes, but crumbling, decayed far beyond what they'd seen inside. Windows were shattered, the roof sagging, and vines covered nearly every inch. It looked like it had been abandoned for far longer than a few decades, as if it had been left to rot for over a century. As they caught their breath, Will noticed something on his hand, a red handprint, like a child's, smeared on his wrist. No matter how much he tried to rub it off, it wouldn't disappear, like a stain that had seeped into his skin. Over the following days, each of them noticed strange things. Footsteps echoing when they were alone, whispers in empty rooms. And sometimes, late at night, they would dream of the red house, of the faces in the photograph with their vacant, watching eyes. The handprints would reappear on their arms and legs, like marks left by something still reaching for them, still trying to pull them back. And though they never returned to the house, the townsfolk say that If you pass by it on a quiet autumn night, you might see shadowy figures moving through the windows, hear faint voices calling out for help, trapped forever in the darkness of the Red House.